Hello everyone. My name is Yana, and I'm a Google Logistics Specialist. I handle delivering a business's target audience with the required parameters. I help scale online sales using those same AI tools in Google Ads. And today's video will be, we're going to focus on the more fundamental knowledge about the differences between these two massive, giant AI-driven strategies for Performance Max. Just a reminder, Performance Max is a type of ad campaign that already uses artificial intelligence. All the others don't use artificial intelligence, they use machine modeling. That's just a quick summary. AI is now ahead of its time, and you have the chance to use it to achieve your goals. So, where do we start? I decided to make a simpler video this time. I'm trying, I hope it will be as simple as possible, because when I made the video about quadrants, and I have a separate video on that, I'll put a link somewhere here, either in the description or in a pinned comment. For some people, it turned out to be really cool, but totally incomprehensible. So I thought I'd re-record it, because this is the foundation you need to work with. I hope that, after watching this video, you'll understand, first, what the fundamental differences between them are, and what they have in common. Second, which of the strategies will suit you better, which one is less suitable at the start, and in what situations you should try one option or the other. Also, why you might have a very high cost per click at the start, or a very low cost per click, depending on the variations of these strategies. You'll also understand why, when you launch, you might not get any sales at all, even though everything seems to be fine. And basically, you should start to get a clearer picture of all this information. So, where do we start? With understanding what smart bidding strategies using AI are, specifically in Google Ads. This is our only advertising tool, which is Performance Max. As I already mentioned, it has two basic strategies with their own subtypes. One of them is called Maximize Conversions, and the other is Maximize Conversion Value. Their subtypes are simply limitations placed on these strategies. For Maximize Conversions, it's a target strategy, with a set target cost per conversion, while for Maximize Conversion Value, it's a target ROAS, meaning there's a conditional return on ad spend. Let's start with these, and then we'll move on to their subtypes. What do these two strategies, Maximize Conversions and target ROAS, have in common, and how do they differ? They share two very important features, one of which you really need to understand. The main similarity between these two strategies is that they have the same priority. That is budget spending. In other words, the main focus of these two smart strategies is to spend your advertising budget as much as possible within the limits you set. One important nuance I want to point out is that Google doesn't think in terms of your daily budgets, it only considers your monthly budgets. So, the initial budget you set is basically calculated as a monthly budget, and then it gets distributed accordingly. In other words, their main goal is to maximize your spending. That's the key point. This is a very important nuance. The second thing they have in common is that they don't have any specific goal. Goals in terms of return on investment, or cost per sale, or cost per phone call, and so on. This is a very important characteristic. Next, this is somewhat of a difference. For Maximize Conversions, it's typical that conversions are optimized only within similar conversions or similar statistics. In other words, the conversion value of the products you want to advertise with Maximize Conversions is usually very similar to each other. If we're talking about Maximize Conversion Value, it succeeds because it can target profitability across a very diverse product assortment in terms of price range. That's their fundamental difference. Now, as for which strategy you should choose in a given situation, here, it's both very simple and at the same time very complicated for you, because, as we discussed with the Maximize Conversion strategy, the conversions being optimized should have similar value. If you remember, when you looked at your ad account, there's a parameter called value, that's revenue, basically, and there's also a parameter called value per conversion. Value per conversion. In our classic scenario, there are very few projects that actually pass on the margin or a certain percentage of the margin or the cost price in the account. Usually, we all just pass on the revenue we received from the sale. Revenue is the gross amount. Overall, if our product isn't being bought as part of a bundle, but rather as single units, then the value of a conversion is basically, this is really important, the price we set for the product. So, the first answer to the question of whether maximize conversions is right for me is that it generally works in most cases, or it starts to target well in cases where your product prices are very, very similar. In other words, you have the minimum number of highs or lows in this selection of products. Another important characteristic of this strategy, from my experience and practice, is that maximize conversions works best at a certain price point. So you need to have an average product price, more or less of equal value, up to a certain threshold where maximize conversions will perform really well. So, what is this threshold? Let's put it this way. I don't know exactly who will be watching me. Which specific businesses, with what average order value, in which countries, I'll be giving a sort of average, right? So, something like the average across the board. And on average, that's an order value from 5 up to a maximum of 15, sometimes up to $20. On average, it's about $5 to $12. That's the average order value where this strategy of yours really takes off. It works great, fantastic, excellent. It performs really well. That's if we're talking about setting the goal for our artificial intelligence to achieve purchases through the shopping cart. Because maximizing conversions also helps generate high sales volumes if we connect it to intermediate goals. But our intermediate goals aren't things like adding to cart or other similar goals. No. For example, I'm talking about phone calls. Because there are some businesses where only a small percentage of sales happen through the shopping cart, and a significant portion of sales actually come from phone calls. There are actually a lot of businesses that operate this way. Some sales happen through online purchases, while others come from phone calls. Sometimes there aren't that many phone calls, but in some cases, phone calls account for 60 to 70% of all sales. And pretending and optimizing your ad account only for the purchase goal is, well, kind of an option. But if you want to grow, it's better to also add this goal to your ad account. If, for example, you don't have the ability to work with offline conversions or the final order status. So, what am I getting at? Then, if we add this goal, phone calls, it's not as crucial to focus on the average check anymore. Here, the emphasis shifts to the quantitative aspect of these conversions. Remember, the maximum number of conversions strategy isn't focused on ROAS or ROMI at all. It doesn't even have a concept like value or profitability. So in our case, by using these additional conversions, we can scale up the advertising campaign. But at the same time, it's very important to pay attention to which price range of your products is generating each specific conversion. Because at some point, you'll want to scale this result, and you'll need to try separating them in a test to see if you can generate more purchases in one price range and more phone calls in another. So, in any case, that's the kind of situation you'll be dealing with. If they're distributed evenly, that's great, that's perfect. But sometimes, in a certain segment or for certain types of products, you might get a number of non-targeted phone calls. And here, if you have to, well, you'll have to dig into this, just so you're aware. You'll need to do some additional analysis within this area. So what's the fundamental difference when we set a target cost per conversion? Because up until now, we were working to maximize conversions, and then we try setting a target cost per conversion. Remember, the difference between not setting a target cost per conversion and setting one is that in the first case, meaning when you don't set it, your budget is spent to the maximum. So you need to understand, maximize conversions is a strategy that should find the maximum number of conversions within the budget you set. So if it found one sale, and you spent, say, 2,000 hryvnias, well, that's the result you get. If you spent, for example, 100 hryvnias, and got 10 sales, then it means the strategy was able to achieve that result. There, are a lot of these criteria, but you need to understand that the number of sales with this strategy is a consequence of it, not a guaranteed outcome of the strategy itself. But target CPA is not, so to speak, a strategy that will radically change the situation. If, for example, you're spending 2,000 hryvnias for just one sale, this is a strategy that should limit certain cost indicators, both quantitative and qualitative, of that single conversion. This is very important because you need to remember that your main enemy here isn't the auction or your competitors, but Google itself. Because by making performance max such a closed structure, it's really hard to break it down into segments, since in every account, different segments and performance max objects affect the main KPIs. The cost per click, which varies across different auctions, can sometimes go a bit beyond reasonable or unreasonable limits. Because when we set a target cost per conversion, that target CPA, for the system it's a clear signal to focus on auctions that specifically bring in conversions at that cost. This is very fundamentally different from the strategy. Profitability is a very sharp narrowing within that line I drew in the quadrants, the one that goes straight up. It operates within very tight boundaries. Also, the smaller the budget you set, the more. This strategy will enter cheaper auctions, but look, the difference is that cheaper auctions don't always lead to a certain number of sales. So, let's do it this way. With a maximize conversion strategy, there's a very common problem when you set a much higher budget than necessary for your products. At the given cost per click, you often end up with an unnaturally high cost per click. Well, first of all, the system has no reference points, so it can just go wild. On the other hand, with target CPA or maximize conversions and a very low budget, you get the opposite effect, where the cost per click is really great, very low. I'll even show a screenshot from some account in a moment. It actually started in Poland, but here's an example of how the cost per click starts with a bigger budget versus a slightly smaller budget. You can see just how much it cuts down the cost per click, and that's even when there weren't any restrictions in place. So, this strategy, without having enough analytics, can do things that might not seem quite reasonable from our perspective. Because basically, if we set a lower budget, just target the same way, at the same cost per click, but get less traffic. But Google has a completely different, technology for this. That's why it makes sense to set a target cost per conversion only when you've gathered some analytics in your account. Because if you set it, for example, right at the very beginning without any analytics in your account, it could lead to you ending up in very low competition auctions. Low competition auctions, under the current auction conditions set by Google, are in most cases, it's important to note, in most cases, pretty much suicide. Because, the more expensive auctions aren't expensive just because everyone decided to set a cost per click of $6 or $7. No. But also, well, yes, of course, that's part of the reason, but it's also because, this cost per click isn't just made up out of nowhere. It's the result of all these prices when everyone wants to compete in this auction and get those sales. Low competition auctions are only suitable for you if you're running a test and need to try out something completely different. Well, for example, if it doesn't matter to you whether the cost per click is, say, 30 cents or $1, and both of them convert, that's absolutely great. In that case, you can really give preference to low competition, low efficiency auctions. But understand one thing. The maximum number of conversions always gets a cost per click that's lower than the break-even point because it enters fewer auctions. It also tries to adjust them to fit this cost per conversion. What does this lead to? That these campaigns, basically, when set to maximize conversions, deliver fewer sales than they could, for example, at break-even. But it's very important. If this is currently profitable for you and it's on the verge of breaking even, it's probably worth gathering more analytics, meaning you should try to scale this maximize conversion strategy. So, to sum up, we've identified who the maximize conversion strategy is suitable for. You should only set a target CPA once you've gathered enough analytics, and you need to determine how many conversions to collect. Basically, you can switch to target CPA even with as few as 10 conversions, especially if your goal is to scale up your budgets very quickly and aggressively. If you have the patience and are willing to let the process run, you can collect at least 10 or 15 of your target actions before setting a target CPA. At the same time, when you increase the budget for maximized conversions, it's not about percentages, it's about the number of conversions, because here the proportion between the budget and the cost per conversion is important. That's if we're talking on average. Now let's move on to maximize conversion value. This strategy also has a similar advantage. A similar thing as maximize conversions. The main priority is spending the advertising budget. At the same time, conversions can have completely different values. So, sometimes you might get one for $20, or $40, or even $100. So, it's going to be completely different each time. But remember, with these two combinations, the value can vary. But with maximum spending, you need to understand that at some point, with small budgets, they can give you really good results. And a great result in what context? That you'll be getting sales. But at some point, you'll want to increase those sales, and the only, unfortunately or fortunately, the easiest way to boost your sales is to enter more auctions. To enter more auctions, you need to increase your spending. In most cases, you'll reach a certain budget threshold, where it's no longer profitable, meaning the value this campaign generates just isn't worth it for you anymore. Also, keep in mind that with the maximize conversion value strategy, just like with maximize conversions, you can sometimes get hit with very high cost per clicks. I mean really high cost per clicks, which might be completely unnatural for your business. There are several reasons why these spikes in cost per click can happen. First, your feed might not be properly adapted to the auction you want to enter. This isn't necessarily good or bad. You tested it, realized something needs to be fixed in the feed, and you need to dig into the feed because it serves as the foundation for targeting. That is, if we're talking about online stores. Another reason for these spikes is that this strategy might be entering search auctions. The cost per click is always high in search auctions. Lately, it's been especially focused on search targeting, even though your search campaigns might actually be dropping in the number of sales. So you don't really know what to do with them. And then you make the typical mistake that other advertisers make too. You start optimizing your search ad campaigns, which actually leads to those sudden spikes in cost per click. Because, after all, Performance Max hides all its fraudulent things, like artificially inflating the cost per click. We can't get away from this, because unfortunately, 90 or even more than 70% of all search traffic in the world belongs to this monopolist. Yes, we've dealt with the crossfire. And another big downside of this maximize conversion value strategy, this is my personal conviction, and it's been proven in practice. It's what I always tell everyone on YouTube when creating ad campaigns. It's what I say during consultations too. Try not to launch ad campaigns using just maximize conversion value. I know it might be working for you. Maybe you're generating some sales with it right now. The question is your ad campaign actually spending a budget of more than $200 or $300 on it or not? If the budget is smaller, well, let's put it this way. There are situations, but they're probably, I don't know, maybe 10 to 20% out of 100, where you can actually have large budgets and maximize conversion value really brings in conversions. But that's only when your campaign generates more than 60 sales per month, then yes, it will work. Because I want to clarify one important point. The difference between maximize conversion value and specifying a target ROAS is that if you don't set this ROAS, and if a significant number of advertisers do the same, we end up influencing the auction to drop to lower and lower profitability thresholds. So, what's the difference, for example, between a project that's profitable in Ukraine and, say, one that's profitable in Germany? In Germany, if we're talking about a local, more or less established store, they want to aim for a multiplier of 4 or 5. These are the bigger ones, the ones that have upselling systems and so on. There are also smaller ones that want something like 8 or 9. Just like our advertisers want a multiplier of 10 or more. That is, they don't want to spend just 10% of their spend on advertising, and that's it, from the margin they have. The reason why, in Germany, they aim for a lower multiplier isn't because their clients are somehow clueless. In some niches here, we actually have worse clients in terms of how they buy products. But it's because, historically, it just turned out that they play with lower rates. Your profitability, 500, 600, even 800%, takes part in the auction. That means if, for example, there are 10 advertisers, they all basically start at 100%. They all influence maintaining the price per click threshold and targeting throughout the entire auction. Yes, you can play around with it further by increasing profitability, reducing the number of conversions, but making each one more profitable, or sacrificing some of your margin to get more sales. These are the conditions of a kind of classic ideal situation. But if a significant part of the market keeps playing without considering profitability, it will lead to what Google itself started doing on a massive scale after March 6th, when they began forcing everyone to lower their profitability, lower your expectations, guys, as they put it. Because if you've ever paid attention to the recommendations for reducing profitability, it always suggests lowering it by 20%. And there are actually a huge number of accounts that, before switching from smart shopping to performance campaigns, were running ad campaigns with a profitability of 3,000%, 4,000%, and they were making sales. But Google gradually forced them to lower and lower that profitability, and this also affects the auction. Google is pursuing its own goals. You also need to stick to your own goals. I'm not saying that you absolutely have to maintain that level of profitability or set it so that the market. You should think only about yourself, and that's perfectly fine. But it's better to set at least some minimum level of profitability because it really does affect the overall dynamics. If you enter the auction for at least half a year, you can really stir things up in the auction over that time. Someone might lower the cost per click, while someone else might, on the contrary, raise it. That's why this is a fundamental and important nuance. So, what's the difference between maximize conversion value and target ROAS? The thing is, target ROAS directs the ad campaign only toward a specific return on ad spend. In other words, it already focuses on the average order value. It looks at which order values convert better, how many products are bought in a single cart, what gets added to the cart, and what gets removed from the cart. It takes more factors into account in order to achieve a specific return on investment. Maximum conversion value does not follow this. Simply, maximum value. Spend as much as the budget allows, and pull in as much as you can. For some people, it delivers amazing results, but in most cases, it gives negative results, where it starts to drop in impressions and goes into the negatives. Plus, the target ROAS keeps all the traffic that Performance Max picks up in a certain balance, because you have to understand there's an AI running things there. AI works in cycles. At some points it focuses more on new users, at other times more on returning ones. Also, the way Performance Max allocates its budget, in my experience, that mechanism has started to change over time. Before, when you increased the budget, it used to be distributed pretty evenly between new and returning users. Now, every time you add more budget, it just blasts it at returning users, which sometimes you don't need at all. And it allocates fewer. A/B tests to new users, especially if these are old Performance Max campaigns. If you see the overall trend for them just dropping down somewhere, without those spikes of better, worse, that means this performance is actually more stagnant, and it's gotten stuck on certain signal elements. The maximum conversion value, it matches that. In other words, it doesn't target in this way. Sometimes, it can even be used for certain kinds of spikes. So, for example, when you were working steadily, then you drop the ROAS to the minimum for 4 or 5 days, and then you set it back again. This only works for accounts that have performance campaigns generating at least 60 to 80 conversions per month. For small accounts, I'm not sure. This will work very well because, and how should I put it? Because the AI still needs a proper database, since AI is kind of like, if you've ever tried. Let me give you an analogy. AI and performance is kind of, not exactly the same, but something similar to when you tried to create an assistant in ChatGPT. You can train the assistant to give you the correct result. To teach it to give the right result, first, you need to explain the logic behind that result and build in the algorithms. And you need to show what you want to get from it, right? For example, you might want it to analyze a table for you based on certain criteria and give you a specific result. To do this, you need to explain how to deliver the result and show what you ultimately want to receive, right? Logically, that's how it works. Even when you sit a person down in front of you and want to teach them some processes, you do something similar. You show them, this is what I need as the end result. It's the same thing with ChatGPT. The same thing applies to AI and Google as well. All your conversions, your set ROAS, these are basically the end results you want to achieve. Yes, sometimes the ROAS you set might be lower, and the actual results higher. That's a slightly different situation. There's always this kind of correlation, not exactly correlation, but a certain proportion is always maintained. It can't be otherwise. But if you operate without ROAS, well, things could change drastically next month, and besides, it's very hard to scale such campaigns. In terms of budget size, especially when your average order value is somewhere around, at most, 800 hryvnias. It's just really hard to scale such a campaign purely for maximum value, because it will eat up everything. It'll consume all your margin and leave you with a profitability of 1, maybe 2, at best 3. For Ukrainians, I don't know who could even afford to do that. But if your average check is higher, for example, 1.5, 2, or 3,000, you won't really feel this on the maximum value strategy. Because most likely, you'll have small budgets set, like $10 to $20. And these budgets basically serve as the limiting factor for this strategy. Well, not completely like target ROAS, but partially. So, with these small budgets, because you're getting sales that are just above the average check, your profitability ends up being higher, and you start thinking that everything seems like everything is basically okay. But, just so you understand correctly, it's not actually okay. This strategy is a bit unsustainable. As soon as you start increasing the budget, auctions will go up, and it will apply the same principle as in this case. So, that was a quick overview of some of the nuances. Maybe I mentioned some things that might be complicated for someone. I'll try to simplify it based on what I understand. So, what else did I want to say? Target profitability is always optimized in the context of different values. So, if you also understand what the average check is, for which, look, I'll probably record the next video about the structures of advertising campaigns that you can use. And the average check is also one of the key points. But the average check doesn't work magic. The check basically, how to put it, makes it more convenient to adjust this profitability. That's what it does. So, what else? What other differences are there between them? With profitability, the cost per click will be much higher than with maximum conversions or its derivatives, because they target different auctions. Even with limited budgets and high profitability targets, the cost per click can still remain quite high in ROAS strategies, that is, those focused on value or revenue, compared to maximum conversions. If one of your strategy options is overspending a lot, then most likely the problem is with the cost per click. So, if your cost per click is, say, up to 2 hryvnias, then setting very high budgets, like, I don't know, above $5 to $8 at the start on a brand new account, sometimes doesn't make sense. And sometimes you can set the equivalent of about $10 to $12 if there are very easy sales. The system will automatically use it to maximize conversions. The same goes for maximizing conversion value. The only thing is that maximizing conversion value might not work well when the order amounts vary a lot, from tens of thousands of hryvnias down to the minimum. There are just some accounts where the amounts are 40 or 50 hryvnias, for example, when some measurements are being taken, so to speak. So keep that in mind. because it might get stuck focusing only on a certain range of products and try to push just those. Right. So we've covered that a bit. Price jumps for cost per click usually happen when you don't have any limits set. I'm not talking about those times when Google acts up for its own reasons. Like, for example, a real situation we had in our account where the budget was set at 50 hryvnias or so, and it spent 10 times more in a day, even though it says itself that it can't spend more than double your daily budget. Or the opposite, where the budget was set at 600 hryvnias and it ended up spending 5,000 hryvnias. Situations like this can also happen. Google, unfortunately, it's not perfect in this regard. There are some internal changes going on. It's basically a machine, a huge computer, and it's just not realistic to make it fully adaptable to every single account, because you have to understand that Google Ads, on average, someone calculated this, handles about 150,000 online sales per second. 150,000. Can you imagine the sheer scale of everything happening online? Of course, some markets are smaller, some are bigger, and sometimes it's really hard to create a universal tool. Alright, so we've got over these features. In which cases is profitability the right choice for you? Profitability is universal. It works for everyone. Whether it's for lead generation or not, it's universal. The only thing you need to understand is, the profitability you want to achieve. You need to figure out what average order value you'll be putting in there, in combination with the type of product or other criteria, and also understand how you'll continue to increase the budget for this campaign. Because in Google's manuals, they show the ideal scenario, a big budget right away. No limits, everything will be great after 4 weeks, or maybe even longer, as some Google reps say. So, this video turned out to be a bit more theoretical for us.